Elena felt the bond snap into place like lightning through her chest, and in that same second, she felt it get ripped away. One moment she was standing in the packed hall of the Blackwood territory, her heart racing as Alpha Damon Cross turned toward her, his eyes locking onto hers with a force that made the whole room go quiet. The mate bond had chosen her. Every wolf in that hall had felt the pull, the shimmer in the air that only happens once, when fate decides two souls belong together. Elena had waited her whole life for this moment, and now it was here, and it was real, and it was hers. Then her sister stepped forward. Vanessa moved with the calm confidence of someone who had never once been told no. She walked straight into the space between Elena and Damon, tilted her chin up, and said the words that changed everything. "There has been a mistake. I am his true mate. Elena is confused." The hall erupted into whispers. Elena opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, her own father stepped beside Vanessa and placed a hand on her shoulder, nodding along, as if this had been rehearsed. Elena's stomach dropped. It had been rehearsed. She could see it now, in the way her father would not meet her eyes, in the way the pack elders exchanged knowing glances, in the way Vanessa's smile never wavered even as she stared directly at the sister she was betraying. "Damon," Elena said, her voice cracking, "you felt it too. You felt the bond. Tell them." Damon looked at her, and for one heartbeat, confusion flickered across his face. He opened his mouth. But before he could answer, the pack's oldest healer, a woman named Priscilla, who had served the Blackwood family for decades, stepped forward with a small ceremonial bowl and announced that the binding ritual had already been completed between Damon and Vanessa 3 nights earlier, in private, as tradition allowed for high-ranking matches. It was a lie. Elena knew it was a lie. There had been no ritual. She had spent every night that week awake, aching with a pull she did not yet understand, a pull that led directly to Damon. But lies, when spoken with enough confidence, in front of enough witnesses, by people with enough power, have a way of becoming truth. Damon's brow furrowed. He looked between the two sisters, and Elena watched something terrible happen in his eyes. Doubt. "The ritual bond cannot be broken once sealed," Priscilla said smoothly. Whatever young Elena believed she felt was simply the echo of her sister's bond, given how close in blood the two of them are. It happens sometimes with siblings, a shadow bond, painful, but not real. It was not true. Shadow bonds were not real. Elena had never even heard of such a thing, because it did not exist. But the crowd murmured in agreement, because Priscilla had never once been wrong about anything to do with the old ways, and no one dared question her now. Elena felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She looked at her father, silently begging him to say something, to defend her, to remember that she was his daughter too. He looked away. That was the moment Elena understood. This had never been a mistake. It had been planned. Every part of it, from the timing of the ceremony to the healer's sudden claim to her own father's silence. Someone had built a trap around her, and she had walked into it wearing a smile, thinking it was the happiest day of her life. Vanessa reached out and took Damon's hand. He did not pull away, whether from confusion or duty or the weight of an entire hall watching him. He let her fingers close around his, and the crowd began to cheer, and somewhere in that cheering, Elena's whole future was being erased. She did not cry. Not there. Not in front of them. She had learned a long time ago that tears were something Vanessa collected like trophies, proof of her own power over people who loved her. Elena would not give her that satisfaction. Instead, she turned and walked out of the hall with her spine straight and her chin level, even though inside she felt like she was being hollowed out piece by piece. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, and she finally let herself lean against the stone wall of the great house, breathing hard, trying to keep herself together. She could still feel it. The bond. Faint now, muffled, like a phone call with a bad connection, but still there, still pulling toward the hall behind her. Shadow bonds were not real. She knew what she had felt. She knew the truth. But knowing the truth and being able to prove it were two very different things. Elena had grown up in her sister's shadow for as long as she could remember. Vanessa was older by 2 years, sharper in politics, more polished in public, and endlessly better at making their parents proud. Elena had always told herself it did not matter, that she was happy simply being herself, quieter, more careful, more honest. She had never once thought her sister would take something from her that could not be replaced. She thought about running. She thought about confronting Damon directly, away from the crowd, away from Priscilla's careful lies. But even as she turned that thought over in her mind, her father found her outside, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "Elena," he said quietly, "I need you to accept this quietly, for the pack, for the family." "You know it's a lie," she said, her voice shaking now that no one else could hear it. "You know what I felt in there." Her father's jaw tightened. "What you felt does not matter anymore. Vanessa's bond has been recognized by the elders. If you fight this, you will only humiliate yourself, and you will humiliate this family. There is no path where you win this, Elena. The only question now is how much you lose." Those words would stay with her for a long time. How much you lose. As if losing was the only outcome available to her. As if her entire future had already been decided by people who had never once asked what she wanted. 3 days later, her father called her into his study and told her, without any warmth in his voice, that a match had been arranged for her. A young alpha from a neighboring territory, named Marcus Thorne. The Thorne pack was smaller, less influential, but proud, and a marriage between the two families would smooth over what her father called the unfortunate confusion from the ceremony. It would give Elena a respectable place. It would give the family peace. Elena had heard the name Marcus Thorne before, whispered in warning tones by wolves who had crossed paths with him. He was known for his temper, for the way pack members under his rule kept their eyes down and their voices low. She had heard stories, the kind of stories that made other alphas quietly avoid alliances with the Thorne territory, but her father did not seem to care about any of that. He needed this marriage to happen, to erase the embarrassment of what Vanessa had done, and Elena's feelings were simply not part of the equation. "I won't do it," Elena said. Her father did not raise his voice. He never needed to. "You will. Because if you don't, Vanessa has already made it clear. She will tell the council that you tried to force a false bond claim to steal her mate. Do you understand what that accusation would do to you? It is punishable by exile, Elena. Not just embarrassment. Exile. From everything you have ever known." Elena stared at him, and for the first time in her life, she truly understood that her father was not going to protect her. He was going to protect the family name, and if that meant sacrificing her, he would do it without hesitation. She thought of fighting. She thought of finding Damon, of trying one more time to make him remember what he had felt in that hall. But every path led back to the same wall. No one would believe her. The pack elders had already accepted Priscilla's word as truth. Vanessa had already secured her place beside Damon as his intended. And if Elena pushed too hard, she would not just lose the mate she was certain belonged to her. She would lose everything. So she said yes. The engagement to Marcus Thorne was announced within the week, and the pack celebrated it as a diplomatic victory, a clever solution to an awkward situation. No one asked Elena how she felt. No one seemed to notice that she had stopped smiling entirely, that she moved through the halls of her childhood home, like a ghost, preparing to leave a house that was never really hers. The night before she was to travel to the Thorne territory, Elena stood at her window and stared out at the stars, and she let herself feel it all, just once, in private, where no one could use it against her. The grief, the anger, the disbelief that her own sister could look her in the eyes and take everything from her without a flicker of guilt. She thought about the bond she had felt with Damon, how certain and warm and right it had seemed, and how quickly it had been stolen and rewritten into something small and shameful. She wondered if he ever thought about that moment, if some part of him still felt the pull toward her the way she still felt it toward him, faint and aching in the back of her mind. She would never get the chance to ask him, because the next morning, a car arrived to take her away from everything she knew, toward a man she had never met, in a territory ruled by fear, and Elena understood, with a cold and heavy certainty, that her real story was only just beginning, and it was going to be far harder than anything she had faced so far. As the car pulled away from the only home she had ever known, Elena did not look back. She could not bear to see her sister standing on the steps, victorious, or her father watching with quiet relief that the problem had finally been solved. Instead, she looked forward, toward the unknown road ahead, and she made herself a quiet promise. She would survive whatever came next. She did not know yet how she would reclaim what had been stolen from her, but she refused to believe that this was the end of her story. Somewhere, deep down, past the grief and the fear, a small stubborn flame refused to go out. She did not know it yet, but that flame would matter more than she could possibly imagine. The Thorn territory looked nothing like the pictures Elena had built in her mind. She had imagined stone walls and green hills, something like her own home, only smaller. Instead, the car rolled through iron gates into a compound that felt more like a fortress than a home. Tall gray buildings pressed close together, guards standing at every corner with hard, watchful eyes. There was no warmth here. She could feel it the moment she stepped out of the car, a heaviness in the air, as if the whole territory had learned long ago not to smile too easily. Marcus Thorn was waiting for her on the front steps. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that studied her, the way someone studies a piece of furniture, deciding where it should go. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He simply looked her over and said, "You're smaller than I thought." It was not a compliment. Elena understood that immediately. "I was told you'd be grateful for this match," Marcus continued, his voice flat. "Given the circumstances." Word traveled fast, apparently. Elena kept her expression calm, refusing to let him see how much those words stung. "I'm here," she said simply. "That should be enough." Something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like surprise, as if he had not expected her to answer back at all. He turned without another word and led her inside, and Elena followed, taking note of everything. The silent staff who kept their eyes on the floor, the way conversations seemed to stop the moment Marcus entered a room, the way even his own pack members flinched slightly when he raised his voice to give an order. The wedding was small and quiet, nothing like the celebration that had been planned for her and Damon. There were no cheering crowds, no joyful howls rising into the night sky. There was only a brief ceremony conducted by a Thorn elder, a signature on official pack documents, and a formal announcement that Elena of the Blackwood family was now bonded, by contract rather than fate, to Alpha Marcus Thorn. Contract bonds were different from true mate bonds. Elena had learned this early in her training as a young wolf, though she had never expected it to apply to her own life. A contract bond joined two wolves through ceremony and law, rather than through the deep, instinctive pull of fate. It could be broken, in theory, though doing so required approval from pack elders, and often came with serious consequences for both families involved. It was a bond built on paper, not on the soul, and Elena felt the difference immediately. There was no warmth in it, no spark, just cold obligation settling over her like a heavy coat she had not chosen to wear. In the weeks that followed, Elena tried to make the best of her new life. She woke early, learned the routines of the Thorn household, and tried to find small ways to feel useful, tending to the garden behind the main house, helping organize the pantry stores, offering quiet company to the younger pack members who seemed just as nervous around Marcus as she was. She told herself that if she simply worked hard and stayed out of his way, life here might become tolerable, even if it could never be happy. But Marcus did not like to be avoided. He began finding reasons to summon her, small tasks that always seemed designed less to help him and more to remind her of her place. He criticized the way she spoke to guests, too formal, he said, or not formal enough, depending on his mood. He commented on her appearance, on the hours she kept, on the friends she was slowly beginning to make among the Thorn pack members, as if every part of her life needed his approval before it was allowed to exist. At first, Elena told herself this was simply how he was, sharp and demanding, but not truly unkind. She had grown up watching her father run a household with quiet control, and she assumed, at first, that Marcus was simply cut from similar cloth, strict but not cruel. She was wrong, and it did not take long to learn it. One evening, Elena made a small mistake during a dinner with visiting pack officials, mispronouncing the name of a nearby territory during polite conversation. It was nothing, the kind of slip anyone might make while nervous and trying to make a good impression. The guests laughed it off kindly and moved on, but after they left, Marcus's mood shifted entirely. He did not raise his voice at first. He simply looked at her, his jaw tight, his eyes cold, and said, "You embarrassed me tonight." "It was a small mistake," Elena said carefully. "I'm sorry, it won't happen again." "You're right," he said, "it won't." The way he said it made her skin prickle with unease. He did not explain further. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dining hall, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. That night, she noticed the household staff seemed to move around her more carefully than usual, as if they knew something she did not. Over the following months, Elena began to understand the true nature of the man she had married. Marcus ruled his pack, and his home, through control. He decided who Elena was allowed to speak with, how much time she spent outside the compound walls, even which letters she was permitted to send back to her family. Any resistance was met with cold silence that could stretch for days, or worse, with a controlled coldness in his voice that made everyone around them go quiet and careful. He never once raised a hand to her, not in those early months, but Elena began to understand that some forms of control did not need physical force to be effective. Fear could be built slowly, through silence, through disapproval, through the constant unspoken threat of what might happen if she pushed too far. She learned to read his moods the way sailors learn to read the sky before a storm, watching for the small signs, the tightness in his jaw, the way his voice dropped low and even right before it turned sharp. She thought often of her old life, of Damon, of the bond she had felt for one brief, shining moment before it was stolen from her. She wondered if he was happy with Vanessa, if he had truly forgotten what had passed between them in that hall, or if some quiet part of him still wondered too. She told herself it did not matter anymore. That life was gone. This was her reality now, and she needed to find a way to survive inside of it. But surviving, she was slowly learning, was not the same as living. Elena began keeping a small journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room, where she wrote down her thoughts each night, the only place in the entire Thorn compound where she felt truly free to say what she really felt. She wrote about her sister's betrayal, about her father's silence, about the strange hollow ache of a bond that had been ripped away before it could ever grow. She wrote about Marcus, about the way his moods shifted like weather, about the quiet dread that had settled permanently into her chest. She did not know, writing those words in secret candlelight, that somewhere within the Thorn compound, someone had already begun to notice her, someone who moved quietly through the shadows of the pack, watching, listening, gathering information that had nothing to do with her personally, and everything to do with the man she had married. His name was Cale, and though Elena had passed him in the hallways more than once without a second glance, one of Marcus's many enforcers, quiet and unremarkable among the rest, he had already begun paying closer attention to her than she realized. He noticed the way she flinched slightly whenever Marcus's voice grew sharp. He noticed the careful, practiced calm she wore like armor in public, and the way it cracked, just slightly, when she thought no one was watching. He said nothing to her, not yet. But he was watching, and waiting, and beginning to understand that there was more happening inside the Thorn compound than most people realized, more than even Elena herself understood, and that the quiet, guarded young woman who had arrived as a stranger might end up being far more important than anyone in this territory had guessed. Winter came early to the Thorn territory that year, and with it came a coldness in the compound that had nothing to do with the weather. Elena had learned, by now, to read the patterns of her husband's temper the way she once read the patterns of clouds before a storm rolling over her childhood home. She knew which hours of the evening were safest, when he was distracted with pack business and unlikely to notice her at all. She knew which topics to avoid at dinner, which servants to steer away from his path when his voice had that particular edge to it. Survival, she had discovered, was mostly a matter of paying very close attention. It was not enough. One evening, a message arrived from her father's territory, a brief update about pack matters that Elena read quickly, before folding it and slipping it into her pocket. She thought nothing of it, but Marcus noticed the paper in her hand at dinner and demanded to see it, his voice carrying that low, dangerous calm that Elena had learned to fear more than shouting. "It's nothing," she said, "just news from home." "Then you won't mind showing me." She hesitated, not because the letter contained anything important, but because handing it over felt like handing over one more small piece of herself, one more corner of her life that still belonged to her alone. That hesitation was enough. Marcus's expression darkened, and the room around them seemed to grow colder. "You keep secrets from me," he said quietly. "It's a letter about pack supplies, Marcus. Nothing more." He did not believe her, or perhaps he did not care whether it was true. What mattered to him was the appearance of control, the idea that his wife might be keeping something, anything, hidden from him. He stood from the table so abruptly that his chair scraped hard against the stone floor, and Elena felt every muscle in her body go still, the way a rabbit goes still when it senses a shadow passing overhead. He did not touch her that night. He simply told her, in a voice stripped of all warmth, that she was no longer permitted to receive letters from her family without his approval first. It was a small punishment, on the surface, a simple rule among many others he had already put in place. But Elena understood the deeper message underneath it. He was closing the last remaining door between her and the world outside these walls, one careful, deliberate inch at a time. She began to feel, more and more, like a bird whose cage kept shrinking, without ever seeming to change shape. There were other nights, harder nights, when his temper did not stay contained behind cold words and closed doors. Elena learned to keep her sleeves long, to angle herself carefully in the mirror each morning, to move through her days with a practiced steadiness that hid what was happening beneath the surface. She told herself it would pass, that if she simply became smaller, quieter, more careful, the storm inside her husband would eventually calm. It never did. What kept her upright during those months was not hope exactly, but something quieter and more stubborn, a refusal to let this become the whole of her story. Late at night, in the private hours after the household had gone silent, she would take out her journal and write, and in those pages, she allowed herself to remember who she had been before all of this. A young woman, who had once felt a bond so strong it lit up an entire room. A sister, who had once trusted the people around her completely. A daughter, who had once believed her father would protect her no matter what. She had lost all three of those things. But she had not lost herself entirely, not yet, and she clung to that small, flickering truth, the way a swimmer clings to driftwood in a rough sea. It was during one of these difficult weeks that Cale first spoke to her directly. She had noticed him before, of course, one of Marcus's enforcers, quiet and steady among the louder, more aggressive men who filled the compound's ranks. He rarely spoke during pack gatherings, and when he did, his words were measured and careful, nothing like the boastful posturing common among the others. She had assumed, without giving it much thought, that he was simply reserved by nature. She found him one afternoon in the quiet garden behind the main house, the one small corner of the compound that still felt like it belonged to her rather than to Marcus. She had gone there to be alone, as she often did, and was surprised to find him standing near the stone wall, apparently doing nothing more than looking out at the hills beyond the compound's boundary. "I didn't think anyone else came here," she said, more out of surprise than complaint. Cale turned, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like concern, quickly smoothed away into careful neutrality. "I like the quiet," he said simply. "I'll leave you to it." "You don't have to," she said, surprising herself. She had grown so used to being alone with her thoughts that the offer of even brief, ordinary company felt strange and welcome. "It's a big garden." He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind, and then he nodded and stayed, keeping a respectful distance, saying little. It was such a small thing, really. Two people standing quietly in the same garden, saying almost nothing to each other. But for Elena, who had spent months feeling entirely unseen inside these walls, it felt like the first true kindness she had been offered since arriving at the Thorn compound. She did not know, that afternoon, that Cale had been watching her far longer than that single meeting suggested. She did not know that his quiet presence in the pack ranks was not simply a matter of personality, but a careful, deliberate disguise. She only knew that for a few brief minutes, standing in the cold winter garden, she had felt a little less alone. It was not much, but after so many months of feeling invisible and afraid, it was enough to remind her that some small part of the world outside her marriage still had room for gentleness. And that reminder, however small, planted a seed of something Elena had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. After that first meeting in the garden, Elena found herself returning to that quiet corner of the compound more often. And more often than not, Cale found his way there too. Their conversations remained brief at first, careful, the kind of exchanges two strangers might have, while both aware that too much familiarity could draw unwanted attention. But slowly, over the following weeks, something between them began to shift. Cale never asked her directly about the bruises she tried to hide beneath long sleeves, or about the careful way she flinched at sudden loud noises. He seemed to understand, without needing to be told, that pushing too hard would only make her retreat further into silence. Instead, he offered small, quiet forms of protection that asked nothing in return. He arranged, without ever explaining how, for her afternoon walks to fall outside the times when Marcus's temper tended to run hottest. He made certain that whenever Elena needed to cross paths with the more aggressive members of the pack, he happened to be nearby, a steady, watchful presence that discouraged anyone from bothering her. She began to notice small things about him that did not quite fit the role of an ordinary enforcer. He carried himself with a discipline that seemed almost military, far more controlled than the rough, unpredictable energy of the other men in Marcus's ranks. He asked careful questions sometimes, about the household routines, about which members of the staff Marcus trusted most, questions that seemed less like idle curiosity and more like someone quietly building a map of the compound's inner workings. She did not ask him about it directly. Some instinct told her that whatever he was doing, whatever careful, hidden purpose moved beneath his calm exterior, it was not something to speak of carelessly within these walls, where every hallway seemed to have ears. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Elena found herself sitting alone in the garden long after the sun had gone down, unable to face returning to the house just yet. Cale found her there, and for the first time, he did not simply stand at a respectful distance. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the quiet steadiness radiating from him, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. "You don't have to stay married to fear," he said finally, his voice low. Elena looked at him, startled by the directness of the words after so many weeks of careful silence between them. "I don't have a choice," she said. "You know that better than anyone here." "There's always a choice," Cale said. "Sometimes it just takes longer to find than we'd like." She wanted to believe him. Some stubborn, exhausted part of her wanted so badly to believe that this was not simply her life now, forever, that somewhere ahead of her there existed a version of her future that did not involve flinching at footsteps in the hallway. But hope, she had learned painfully over the past months, could be a dangerous thing to hold on to too tightly in a place like this. "Why do you care?" she asked quietly. "You barely know me." Cale was silent for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because I've seen what happens to people who are trapped somewhere like this for too long," he said. "And I don't like watching it happen twice." There was something in the way he said it, a weight underneath the words that suggested a story of his own, one he was not ready to share. Elena did not press him. She understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to carry a private grief that words could not easily reach. In the weeks that followed, their quiet friendship deepened, though it remained carefully hidden from the rest of the compound. Cale became, without either of them naming it directly, the one steady point of safety in Elena's otherwise uncertain days. She found herself looking forward to their brief moments together, the garden conversations, the small unspoken kindnesses, in a way that both comforted and frightened her. She had learned, painfully, not to let herself depend on anyone, and yet here she was, quietly grateful for a man whose true purpose in this compound she did not fully understand. Meanwhile, far from the Thorn territory, in the halls of the Blackwood pack, something else had begun to shift as well. Damon had noticed it slowly at first, a strange hollowness in his bond with Vanessa that he could not quite name. He told himself, in the early weeks after the ceremony, that it was simply the natural adjustment period every new match went through. But the feeling did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger, an unsettled, wrong sensation that sat heavy in his chest whenever Vanessa was near. He found himself, more and more often, thinking of the other sister, Elena. He remembered, with a clarity that unsettled him, the exact moment their eyes had met across that crowded hall, the way the entire room had seemed to fall away, the way something ancient and certain had clicked into place inside him. He had spent months trying to convince himself that whatever he had felt in that moment had simply been confusion, a trick of instinct that Priscilla's explanation had rightly corrected. But the doubt would not leave him alone. One evening, while reviewing old pack ceremony records out of nothing more than restless curiosity, Damon came across a detail that made him go very still. According to tradition, any private binding ritual performed between an alpha and his intended required the presence of at least 2 witnesses beyond the officiating elder, their names recorded formally in the pack ledger. He searched the ledger for the entry documenting his supposed private ceremony with Vanessa, the one that had been used to justify overriding the mate bond in that crowded hall. There was no entry at all. Damon sat with that discovery for a long time, the quiet study around him suddenly feeling very cold. A missing ledger entry could mean many things. A clerical oversight, a simple mistake made in the chaos of a busy season. But some instinct, the same deep instinct that had once pulled him toward Elena across a crowded room, told him it was not a mistake at all. He closed the ledger slowly, his mind already turning toward questions he was not sure he wanted answered, and yet knew he could not ignore any longer. Damon did not confront Vanessa right away. He had learned enough, in his years as Alpha, to know that accusations without proof were worse than silence, especially when they involved the woman who now shared his household and his title. Instead, he began asking careful questions, quietly, in the spaces between pack business, gathering pieces of a picture he was not yet ready to fully see. He started with Priscilla, the healer whose word had ended the matter so decisively on the night of the ceremony. He asked her, casually, over a routine visit regarding pack health matters, to walk him through the details of the private binding ritual she claimed had taken place. She answered smoothly, as she always did, describing the ceremony with the kind of practiced detail that should have put his mind at ease. Except one detail did not sit right with him. She described performing the ritual in the eastern chapel of the Great House, the smaller ceremonial room used for private pack matters. But Damon distinctly remembered, because it was the kind of detail an Alpha was required to track, that the eastern chapel had been undergoing repairs to its stone flooring during the exact week Priscilla claimed the ceremony had taken place. It had been closed off entirely, sealed with warning markers, unusable for any ritual purpose. He said nothing in the moment, thanking her for her time, and leaving the conversation as calmly as he had entered it. But inside, something had shifted permanently. The lie was no longer a vague suspicion living in the back of his mind. It was a specific, provable inconsistency, and once he saw it clearly, he could not unsee it. He began digging deeper, carefully, quietly, aware that if Vanessa or her allies discovered what he was doing too soon, whatever truth existed would simply be buried further beneath new layers of careful lies. He spoke with staff members who had been present in the Great House during that week, framing his questions casually, as if simply curious about pack history. Slowly, piece by piece, a different story began to take shape, one that had nothing to do with a private binding ceremony, and everything to do with a carefully constructed deception. One of the older staff members, a groundskeeper named Owen who had served the Blackwood family for over 20 years, mentioned almost in passing that he remembered Vanessa visiting Priscilla's private chambers late one night, the week before the ceremony, carrying a small wrapped package. He had thought nothing of it at the time, assuming it was simply a gift between old family friends. But now, hearing the question phrased carefully by his own Alpha, he seemed to sense that this small memory carried more weight than he had originally realized. Damon thanked him and walked away, with his mind racing. A wrapped package, delivered quietly, the week before Priscilla's sudden and convenient testimony that had erased Elena's rightful claim entirely. It was not proof, not yet, not the kind that could stand before a formal council hearing, but it was enough to confirm what some deep, instinctive part of him had known from the very beginning. He had not imagined the bond with Elena, he had felt it because it was real, and somewhere, deliberately, cruelly, that truth had been buried beneath layers of lies built by people he had trusted completely. That night, Damon found himself unable to sleep, his mind replaying the moment in that crowded hall over and over, the way Elena's eyes had found his, the way something ancient and certain had settled into place before it was so quickly, so cruelly, taken from him. He thought of her now, wherever she was, married off to a stranger, while he had spent the past months building a life beside the very sister who had stolen her happiness. He thought about what her life might look like now, in a territory he barely knew anything about, bonded to an Alpha whose reputation, he now recalled uneasily, was not a particularly gentle one. A cold, sick feeling settled into his stomach, one that had nothing to do with the lies surrounding his own bond, and everything to do with fear, for a woman he had spent one single brief moment with and had never been allowed to know. He needed proof, real, undeniable proof, that could stand before the council and force them to reconsider everything that had happened that night. Confronting Vanessa now, with only fragments and suspicions, would simply give her time to cover her tracks further, to silence Owen, to convince Priscilla to strengthen her story before anyone official became involved. So Damon did the hardest thing he had done since that night in the crowded hall. He waited, and he watched, and he continued the careful, quiet work of building a case strong enough that no one, not even the most stubborn elder on the council, could dismiss it as confusion or coincidence. Meanwhile, Vanessa noticed nothing unusual in her husband's behavior, or so she believed. She was far too occupied with the comfortable position she had built for herself, the admiration of pack members who saw her as a clever, capable future Luna, the quiet satisfaction of having finally stepped fully out of her younger sister's shadow. She rarely thought of Elena at all these days, and when she did, it was with the same dismissive certainty she had carried since childhood. Elena had always been the quieter one, the one who accepted things without much fight. Surely by now, she had settled into her new life without much complaint. She had no idea that her husband's doubt had grown into something far more dangerous than simple suspicion. She had no idea that somewhere, deep within the walls of a compound she had never once thought to worry about, her sister's quiet strength was slowly, steadily, building into something Vanessa had never accounted for. The lie she had built so carefully was still standing, but its foundation had already begun, quietly and irreversibly, to crack. While Damon carefully built his case within the Blackwood territory, a different kind of investigation was unfolding within the walls of the Thorn compound, one that Elena knew nothing about until the night everything finally came into the open. Cale had spent the better part of a year embedded within Marcus's pack, though almost no one there knew his true purpose. He had been sent by the Lycan High Council, the governing body that oversaw disputes and serious violations across all territories, after a string of quiet complaints had reached them regarding the Thorn Pack. Complaints about missing supply shipments meant for neighboring territories, about pack members who had transferred out of Thorn lands under suspicious circumstances, about a pattern of fear and silence that seemed to follow Marcus Thorn wherever his influence reached. Cale's assignment had been straightforward at first, to gather evidence of Marcus's misuse of pack resources and his mistreatment of those under his command, documentation that could eventually be presented before the council to strip him of his alpha title if the claims proved true. It was careful, patient work, the kind that required blending in completely, becoming just another quiet enforcer among many, watching and listening far more than speaking. He had not expected, when he first arrived at the Thorn compound, to find himself growing genuinely protective of the Alpha's new wife. At first, Elena had simply been another detail in his careful observations, evidence of the kind of control Marcus exerted over everyone in his orbit. But the longer Cale watched her navigate the compound with quiet, careful dignity, refusing to let fear fully break her spirit, even after everything she had clearly endured, the more his professional observation shifted into something else entirely. He found himself arranging his patrol schedules around her safety, without fully admitting to himself why. He found himself thinking about her long after their brief garden conversations ended. He told himself, for a long time, that this was simply part of the job, that protecting a vulnerable pack member fit naturally within his broader mission. But some nights, lying awake in his small quarters within the compound, he knew that explanation was no longer entirely honest. The investigation reached a turning point on a cold evening, when Cale intercepted a private message meant for Marcus, a coded communication from a supplier, confirming an illegal shipment of contraband goods scheduled to pass through Thorn lands the following week. It was exactly the kind of concrete evidence the council needed, proof that Marcus was not simply a difficult, temperamental alpha, but a man actively engaged in serious violations that endangered multiple territories. Cale knew he needed to act quickly now. Once he reported this evidence to the council, they would move to intervene directly, likely within days. And when that happened, everything within the Thorn compound would change rapidly and without warning. Marcus would not go quietly. Cale had seen enough of the man's temper to know that when his control began slipping, when he felt the walls of his authority closing in, he would become far more dangerous, not less. Elena would be in the most danger of anyone. Cale found her in the garden that same evening, and something in his expression must have carried the weight of what he had learned, because she looked at him with quiet alarm the moment he approached. "Something's wrong," she said. It was not a question. Cale hesitated. weighing carefully how much he could safely tell her without putting his investigation, or her safety, at greater risk. "I need you to trust me," he said finally. "Whatever happens in the coming days, I need you to stay close to the house, and if I ever tell you it's time to leave quickly, I need you to move without questions." Elena stared at him, searching his face for answers he was not yet ready to give. "Who are you really?" she asked quietly. He met her eyes steadily. "Someone trying to make sure you get out of here safely," he said. "That's all I can tell you right now, but it's the truth." She wanted to press further, to demand a full explanation, but something in his steady, careful expression told her this was not the moment for that conversation. Instead, she nodded slowly, and for the first time since arriving at the Thorn compound, she allowed herself to fully believe that an escape from this life might actually be possible, not just a distant, desperate hope, but something real, something already quietly in motion. That night, lying awake in the cold silence of her room, Elena thought about everything Cale's warning implied. Something was about to change, dramatically, and soon. She did not know exactly what, but she understood enough to feel the shift in the air, the same kind of pressure that builds before a storm finally breaks. She thought too about Damon, and about the strange, aching certainty that had never fully left her, even after all these months of forced distance and Priscilla's careful lies. She wondered if he ever thought of her still, if any part of the bond she had felt so briefly and so powerfully remained alive within him, buried beneath whatever life he had built with her sister. She did not know that, hundreds of miles away, in the quiet hours of that very same night, Damon sat awake in his own study, staring at a growing collection of evidence that pointed toward exactly the truth she had never stopped believing. Both of them, in their separate corners of a world that had conspired to keep them apart, were closer than either realized to the truth finally coming undone. The final piece of Damon's investigation fell into place sooner than he expected, and in a way he never could have predicted. It began with a visit from a traveling merchant who occasionally supplied rare herbs to the Blackwood healers. During a routine delivery, the merchant mentioned, almost as idle conversation, that he had recently completed a similar delivery to the Thorn territory, and had heard troubling talk among the staff there about the young Alpha's new wife, a quiet woman who rarely left the compound and seemed to carry herself like someone under constant strain. Damon's attention sharpened immediately. "Her name," he said, keeping his voice carefully even. "Did you hear her name?" The merchant thought for a moment. "Elena, I believe. Married into the Thorn family some months back. Sad business, from what the staff whispered. Kept very close to the house, that one. Not much freedom given to her, if the rumors are true." Damon felt something cold and furious settle into his chest. Every suspicion he had carefully gathered over the past months suddenly crystallized into something sharper, more urgent. Elena was not simply living a difficult but manageable arrangement in a neighboring territory. She was suffering, quietly, exactly the way he had feared but had not allowed himself to fully imagine. He thanked the merchant and immediately called for Owen, the groundskeeper whose earlier testimony about Vanessa's late-night visit to Priscilla's chambers had first cracked open his investigation. This time, Damon asked him to formally document his memory in writing, with his full name attached, understanding clearly what that testimony would eventually be used for. Owen agreed without hesitation. He had served the Blackwood family faithfully for decades, and the quiet unfairness done to Elena had clearly weighed on him as much as it now weighed on his Alpha. With Owen's written testimony, the missing ledger entry, and Priscilla's contradictory description of a chapel that had been sealed for repairs during the supposed ceremony, Damon finally had enough to bring the matter before the pack elders formally. It was not overwhelming proof, not yet, but it was more than enough to demand a full, official reconsideration of the ceremony that had determined his bond all those months ago. He requested a private meeting with 3 of the most respected elders on the Blackwood Council, presenting his evidence calmly and methodically, watching their expressions shift from polite skepticism to genuine concern as he laid out each inconsistency. By the end of the meeting, the elders agreed that the matter required a formal hearing, with Priscilla required to answer directly for the discrepancies in her account. Word of the upcoming hearing reached Vanessa within hours, and for the first time since the night of the original ceremony, real fear crept into her carefully composed expression. She confronted Damon that evening, her voice sharp with practiced indignation. "You're doing this because of her," Vanessa said. Because you never truly accepted our bond. I'm doing this because our bond was never real, Damon replied evenly. You know that better than anyone, Vanessa. I want to hear you say it. She did not say it. She simply stared at him, her composure cracking at the edges, and then turned and left the room, without another word, which told Damon everything he needed to know. That same week, urgent news arrived from the Lycan High Council regarding an entirely separate matter, one that Damon had not anticipated would intersect so directly with his own investigation. The council announced that they would be sending a formal delegation to the Thorn territory within days, following a lengthy investigation into serious violations committed by Alpha Marcus Thorn, including illegal trade activity and a documented pattern of abuse toward pack members under his authority. Reading the announcement, Damon felt the last remaining pieces of the picture snap into place with terrible clarity. Elena was not simply living under a difficult husband. She was living under an alpha the council itself had identified as dangerous enough to warrant direct intervention. He did not wait for the formal hearing regarding his own bond to conclude before deciding to act. Whatever the council eventually determined about the true circumstances of his ceremony, he could not sit quietly any longer while Elena remained inside a compound, about to become the site of a serious confrontation between Marcus and council enforcement officials. If Marcus's temper turned dangerous when confronted, and everything Damon had learned about the man's reputation suggested it would, Elena could be caught directly in the middle of it. He requested an urgent audience with the council delegation, preparing to travel to the Thorn territory, presenting his own evidence regarding the fraudulent ceremony, and formally requesting permission to accompany them, citing his responsibility to ensure the safety of a Blackwood pack member currently residing within Thorn lands. Given the seriousness of both matters now clearly intertwined, the council granted his request. 3 days later, Damon set out for the Thorn territory alongside the council delegation, carrying with him not only the evidence that could finally restore the truth of his bond, but a fierce, unshakable determination to make certain that Elena, whatever she had endured these past months, would never have to face that kind of fear again. He did not know exactly what he would find when he arrived. He only knew that he was done waiting, done doubting, done allowing lies built by people he had once trusted to determine the course of 2 lives that had never stopped belonging to each other. The morning the council delegation arrived at the Thorn compound, Elena knew immediately that something significant was happening. She woke to the sound of unfamiliar vehicles rolling through the gates, far more organized and official than the usual comings and goings of pack business. From her window, she watched a formal procession of council representatives step out, their dark uniforms marking them clearly as figures of serious authority, not the kind of visitors Marcus could simply intimidate into silence. Cale found her quickly, his expression tense but controlled. "It's happening now," he said. "The council is here to formally address the violations we discussed. I need you to stay in your room until I come for you. Do not go looking for Marcus. Do not try to intervene, no matter what you hear." Elena's heart pounded. Fear and cautious hope tangled together so tightly, she could barely separate them. "What's going to happen to him?" "That depends on how he responds," Cale said carefully. "I won't lie to you. He may not respond well." Downstairs, Marcus met the delegation, with the same cold confidence he carried into every confrontation, clearly expecting to intimidate his way through whatever accusations they had brought. But as the lead council representative began outlining the evidence gathered against him, the illegal trade activity, the documented pattern of abuse toward pack members, the formal complaints filed by wolves who had fled his territory over the past year, Marcus's composure began to crack, in a way Elena, watching quietly from the top of the staircase despite Cale's warning, had never seen before. "This is absurd," Marcus snapped, his voice rising sharply. "You have no authority here." "We have full authority, granted by unanimous vote of the High Council," the representative replied evenly. "You will surrender your alpha title and submit to formal review, effective immediately." What happened next unfolded quickly. Marcus, refusing to accept the loss of his authority, moved aggressively toward the lead representative, and in that same instant, Cale stepped forward from among the gathered enforcers, revealing openly for the first time that he had been working alongside the council delegation the entire time. Several other enforcers, wolves who Elena now realized had likely been quietly recruited by Cale over the preceding months, moved to restrain Marcus before the situation could escalate further. Marcus's eyes found Kale across the chaos, understanding dawning with furious clarity. "You," he snarled. "You've been working against me this entire time." "I've been doing my job," Kale said simply, his voice calm, even as Marcus struggled against the enforcers holding him. "Something you stopped doing a long time ago, when you decided your authority meant you could treat people however you pleased." It was in that chaotic moment, with Marcus being formally restrained and the compound in an uproar, that Elena saw a familiar figure step through the front gates, moving quickly past the confusion, with an urgency that stopped her breath entirely. Damon. For a moment, standing at the top of the staircase, Elena wondered if exhaustion and fear had finally caused her mind to conjure an image she desperately wanted to see. But then his eyes lifted, scanning the chaos of the entrance hall, and found her exactly the way they had found her once before, across a crowded room, months and months ago, when everything had still seemed possible. The bond, faint and muffled for so long, surged back to life so suddenly, and so powerfully, that Elena had to grip the staircase railing to keep herself steady. Judging by the way Damon froze completely at the base of the stairs, his expression breaking open with an emotion too raw to fully hide, he felt it too. Undeniable and overwhelming, exactly as it should have felt the very first time, before it was stolen from them both. Neither of them spoke at first. There was too much chaos still unfolding around them. Marcus being led away in restraints, council representatives calling out formal instructions to secure the compound, pack members whispering in stunned disbelief at how quickly their world had shifted. But amid all of it, Damon crossed the remaining distance and climbed the staircase until he stood directly in front of her. Close enough now that Elena could see every detail of relief and fury and tenderness warring across his face. "I should have fought harder that night," he said quietly. "I'm sorry it took me this long to understand what happened." Elena felt tears finally break through the careful composure she had maintained for so many months, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming release of finally being seen, truly and completely, by someone who had traveled this far to make things right. "You're here now," she said softly. "That has to count for something." Around them, the compound continued its chaotic transformation, Marcus's reign coming to its final, undignified end, Kale quietly coordinating with the council representatives to secure the safety of the remaining pack members. But in that one small, still moment on the staircase, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, to believe that the worst of her story was finally, truly behind her. In the days that followed the council's intervention at the Thorn compound, Elena's life began changing so rapidly that it sometimes felt difficult to keep pace with it all. Marcus was formally stripped of his alpha title and placed under council custody, pending a full review of the charges against him, a process that would likely take months to resolve completely, but one that meant, for the first time since her wedding day, Elena was finally, truly free of him. The Thorn Pack itself entered a period of careful transition, with a council-appointed representative overseeing daily operations until new leadership could be established. Many of the pack members Elena had come to know during her time there, quiet, careful people who had lived under Marcus's control for far longer than she had, approached her in the days that followed with quiet gratitude, understanding that her situation had ultimately helped bring long-overdue attention to what had been happening within their territory. Kale remained at the compound briefly, to complete his formal report for the council, and Elena found a private moment to speak with him, before she departed for the Blackwood territory alongside Damon. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. I don't think I would have made it through this year without knowing someone here actually saw me." Kale offered her a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him without any careful restraint behind it. "You were stronger than you gave yourself credit for," he said. "I just made sure you had the space to prove it." There was a quiet warmth between them, born from months of careful trust, built under difficult circumstances, but nothing more complicated than that, a bond of genuine friendship rather than anything deeper. Elena understood, watching Kale prepare to continue his work for the council in whatever territory needed him next, that his role in her story had been exactly what it needed to be, a steady hand, offered at precisely the moment she needed one most, without ever asking for anything in return. The journey back to the Blackwood territory felt entirely different from the journey that had first taken her away from it, Where that earlier trip had carried her forward in silence and dread, this one carried the strange, cautious lightness of someone slowly remembering how to hope again. Damon sat beside her for most of the ride, careful to give her space when she needed it, but present in a steady, quiet way that felt entirely different from the desperate control she had grown so used to fearing. "The council has scheduled a formal hearing," he told her, as the familiar hills of her childhood territory began to appear in the distance. "To review everything that happened the night of the original ceremony. Priscilla will be required to answer for her testimony." Owen has already provided a formal statement. Elena felt a complicated mixture of relief and apprehension settle in her chest. "And Vanessa?" Damon's expression grew serious. "She'll have to answer for her part in it as well. I won't pretend to know exactly how the elders will decide to handle that, but the truth is finally going to be heard, Elena. That much I can promise you." It was strange, returning to the great house where her old life had ended so abruptly, walking through halls that still carried memories of that terrible night. But this time, Elena walked through them with her head held high, no longer the frightened young woman who had been pushed aside and silenced, but someone who had survived months of genuine hardship and come out the other side with her spirit, however tested, still fully intact. Her father met her at the entrance, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of guilt and relief that Elena did not yet feel ready to forgive completely. There would be difficult conversations ahead, about the choices he had made, about the silence he had chosen when she needed him most. But for now, she simply nodded to him and continued forward, unwilling to let old wounds overshadow the fragile new beginning waiting for her within these walls. That evening, standing once again in the great hall where everything had first gone wrong, Elena felt the bond between herself and Damon settle fully and completely into place. Steady and warm, and entirely undeniable, exactly the way it always should have been. It was not a dramatic, sweeping moment this time, no crowd of witnesses, no ceremony. Just two people who had both endured a year of hardship finally standing together, quietly certain of what they had both known from the very beginning. "We have a hearing to prepare for," Damon said softly, reaching for her hand. Elena laced her fingers through his, feeling steadier than she had in longer than she could remember. "Then let's go make sure the truth finally wins." The formal hearing took place 2 weeks later, in the same great hall where Elena's entire life had been rewritten by a single well-timed lie. This time, the hall was filled not with celebration, but with the tense, watchful silence of a pack waiting to learn the truth about people they had trusted completely. Priscilla was called first, and under the direct, careful questioning of the presiding elders, her carefully constructed story began falling apart within minutes. She could not explain the missing ledger entry. She stumbled over her earlier description of the Eastern Chapel, growing visibly flustered when confronted with maintenance records proving the room had been sealed for repairs during the exact week she claimed to have performed the ceremony there. Owen's written testimony regarding Vanessa's late-night visit to her chambers, delivered calmly and without hesitation, finally broke whatever remained of her composure entirely. Faced with evidence she could no longer explain away, Priscilla finally admitted the truth. There had been no private ceremony. Vanessa had approached her the week before the public bonding hall, offering a substantial gift in exchange for her testimony, understanding that as the pack's most respected healer, her word would carry enough weight to override even the clear, undeniable signs of a true mate bond witnessed by an entire hall of people. The admission sent a wave of shocked murmurs through the gathered crowd. Vanessa, seated near the front with her composure finally, completely cracking, opened her mouth to protest. But the elders had heard enough. The evidence was undeniable now, confirmed directly by the very person whose false testimony had made the original deception possible. The council's judgment was swift and serious. Priscilla was stripped of her position as pack healer and formally banned from ever holding a position of trust within pack governance again, her decades of respected service undone entirely by the choice she had made that fateful week. Vanessa faced the full weight of the council's judgment as well, found guilty of orchestrating a deliberate fraud against her own sister, a violation the elders considered serious enough to warrant exile from the Blackwood territory entirely. Elena watched her sister's face as the sentence was read, searching for some flicker of the person she had once loved and trusted completely as a child, before ambition and jealousy had quietly poisoned everything between them. She found only cold, wounded pride, the same expression Vanessa had worn her entire life, whenever she failed to get exactly what she wanted. "I never meant for it to go this far," Vanessa said quietly, when the elders finally allowed her a final statement. Elena felt many things in that moment: grief for the relationship they had once shared, lingering anger for everything she had endured because of her sister's choices, and beneath it all, a strange, quiet exhaustion that came from finally being able to set down a burden she had carried for far too long. "But it did go this far," Elena said simply. "And I hope, wherever you go next, you finally learn what it costs to take something that was never yours." Vanessa said nothing more. She was escorted from the hall that same afternoon, her exile effective immediately, and Elena watched her walk away, without the satisfaction she might once have imagined feeling. There was only a quiet, settled peace, the sense of a long, painful chapter finally closing completely. With the truth fully restored, the council formally recognized Elena's original mate bond with Damon, dissolving the fraudulent claim that had stolen a year of both their lives. The celebration that followed felt entirely different from the one that had been cut short so cruelly the first time, quieter, more grounded, carrying the weight of everything both of them had survived to finally reach this moment. Kale arrived a few days later, having completed his formal report on the Thorn territory, and Elena welcomed him warmly, as an honored guest, at the modest gathering held to mark her and Damon's properly recognized bond. The new leadership installed at the Thorn Pack, she learned, was already working to rebuild trust among pack members who had lived too long under fear, and Marcus's formal review by the council continued, ensuring he would answer fully for everything he had done. As for Elena's father, their relationship remained a work in progress, built slowly and carefully on honest conversations neither of them had been willing to have before. He had failed her when she needed him most, and rebuilding trust after that kind of failure would take time. But he had also, in the difficult weeks following the hearing, taken real steps to make amends, supporting her fully during the proceedings, and finally speaking the truth publicly when it mattered most. Standing beside Damon months later, in a garden not so different from the quiet one where she had once found unexpected friendship inside a compound built on fear, Elena felt the last remnants of the year she had survived settle into something she could finally carry with peace rather than pain. She had lost so much: a sister's trust, a father's protection, months of her life stolen by other people's ambition and cruelty. But she had also discovered, through everything, a strength she had never fully known she possessed, and a bond that had proven, in the end, unbreakable, exactly the way fate had always intended it to be. She had never expected, on that terrible night the truth was first stolen from her, that her story would end here, standing steady and whole beside the mate who had never stopped searching for the truth, surrounded by people who had chosen, in their own quiet ways, to stand beside her when it mattered most. But looking back now, she understood something important. The people who try hardest to take everything from you rarely expect the quiet, stubborn strength it takes to get it all back. And Elena, finally, completely, had gotten it all back.